Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kiorkof, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my top 16 tight end and quarterback rankings for Week 1 of the 2024 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm going to be talking about each of these players on an individual basis, sharing with you guys my thought process and opinions, while also presenting the statistics that justify the reasons as to why I have them ranked as such going into Week 1. Now, if you're looking for my thoughts on a specific player, there are timestamps down in the description of every single video, so be sure to check that out while you're down there. Be sure to subscribe because we're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2024 season with the singular goal of trying to help you capture a 2024 fantasy football championship. Also, the last reminder before we get into talking about these players, in the next coming days, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, I'll be live streaming every single day. For more details, go to the pinned comment in the comment section. All of the information regarding what time those streams starts will happen there. And if you have any questions for Week 1, be sure to swing on by. Thank you very much. Okay, let's get into talking about my Week 1 tight end rankings, beginning with Travis Kelce, who takes on the Baltimore Ravens on Thursday Night Football. Yes, we are just one day away from the kickoff of the 2024 season. The last time Travis Kelce had an opportunity of taking on the Baltimore Ravens was in the AFC Championship game. Within that contest, 11 targets, 11 receptions, 116 receiving yards, a receiving touchdown for 23.6 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. But I will put it into perspective. When Travis Kelce's in the playoffs, he's pretty much in Super Saiyan 3. We really do see an accelerated level of opportunity and production from Travis Kelce when they're in the playoffs. Specifically, in the 4 playoff games that they played last season, he had 37 targets and 32 receptions. 8 receptions per game, a pretty ridiculous number, but hopefully he can transition that momentum going into Week 1, which may feel like a playoff game of sorts, perhaps a game we may see later down the line in the NFL playoffs for the 2024 season. But again, Travis Kelce is one of the best tight ends in the league. He's played incredibly well over the course of his career, and I don't see him slowing down. Obviously, his age is getting up there, but when you take into account that he has Patrick Mahomes throwing him the ball, I mean, over the course of the last 3 seasons, September Mahomes is a thing. Patrick Mahomes in the month of September, in the last 9 games, 24 passing touchdowns. That's 2.7 per game on average. There's going to be a lot of opportunity, especially with Marquise Hollywood-Brown down and dealing with an injury. Travis Kelce is our number 1 going into the week. Our number 2, we have Sam LaPorta of the Detroit Lions. He took on the LA Rams in the NFL playoffs. Most recently in that game, 3 targets, 3 receptions, 14 receiving yards, 1 receiving touchdown, only 8.9 fantasy points. But I would like to put it into perspective. When he took on the LA Rams, going into that week, there was no expectation of Sam LaPorta even suiting up to play, primarily because he got injured in the Week 18 game against the Minnesota Vikings last season. So he was dealing with an injury, still managed to find himself a touchdown. And going into this Sunday night's football game against the Los Angeles Rams, the expectation is that he should be able to find the end zone once again, primarily because the Los Angeles Rams have struggled against opposing tight ends. Last season, they were giving up the 4th most points to opposing tight ends on a per game average, 11.04 on a weekly basis. So if we're anticipating Sam LaPorta fully healthy, of course, the number 2 target of this offense, the highest implicated score of all games going into Week 1. This should be a shootout between these 2 teams. The usual production of Sam LaPorta is 11.5 fantasy points, 7.5 targets. Those are accelerated numbers in comparison to what he got in the last time he was going up against the Los Angeles Rams. Expect a lot more in this game. Now, before we continue on, I want to remind you guys, if you have not yet already, and you guys want my 2024 fantasy football rankings every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season, be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy, link down in the description. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only will you be able to get my 2024 fantasy football draft guide rankings for those of you who have not drafted yet and are waiting for the final moments, you'll also get to claim the first-time deposit offer, but you'll get my rankings every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. These are by position, by tier, half PPR, full PPR, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, defense, and flex. So for those of you interested, take advantage of the opportunity by checking out the right side of the map to determine your eligibility based on your current location. If you are not eligible because you have used the code in the past or your location does not permit it, you can also go ahead and check out the Patreon, link down in the description, offering all of this content and much more. Thank you very much for all the support. All right, let's go to our number 3. We have Trey McBride, who going into this matchup against the Buffalo Bills, the anticipation is that this is going to be a negative game script. And for the majority of this second half, the Arizona Cardinals will be throwing the ball, primarily because the Arizona Cardinals are plus 6.5 point underdogs going into Week 1's matchup. The anticipation based on projections from Vegas is that the Buffalo Bills are supposed to put a 30 bomb on this defense, and that honestly makes sense. The Arizona Cardinals defense is not great, especially their secondary, and the anticipation is Trey McBride in the second half of this game should see himself a lot of opportunity and hopefully with those targets lead to receptions and yards and potentially find himself in the end zone. Last season from weeks 10 through 18 with Kyler Murray, averaging 8.25 targets and 11.54 fantasy points per game. We're hoping for similar numbers in Week 1. Number 4, we have Dalton Kincaid. In this same matchup, taking on the Arizona Cardinals, like I just mentioned moments ago, the projections that we have seen from Vegas implies that the Buffalo Bills should be scoring 30 points in this game and are 6.5-point favorites. So this really is just going to put all of the questions to rest from this offseason. A lot of people have argued as to whether or not Dalton Kincaid is the number one target of this offense. And my anticipation is that, yes, he is the number one target. He is going to get himself a vast majority of the overall targets within this Buffalo Bills passing attack. And if the Buffalo Bills are projected to score 4 or more touchdowns in a singular game, I would like to hope to assume that Dalton Kincaid can catch one of them. Number 5. We have Evan Engram. Taking on the Miami Dolphins in week 1 is an advantageous matchup. Last season, they were allowing the 5th most points to opposing tight ends on a weekly basis in a half PPR scoring format, 10.46. So Evan Engram should be able to seamlessly find himself success. And the way that Evan Engram finished the 2023 season from weeks 13 through 18, averaging 10.2 targets, 8.3 receptions, 73 receiving yards, a receiving touchdown 2 out of every 3 games, and 15.15 fantasy points per game. Unbelievable numbers. Now, of course, a lot of that, like we've talked about this offseason, was due and can be attributed to the absence of Christian Kirk. But I do want to go ahead and put it out there that without Calvin Ridley and Zay Jones, Evan Engram could very easily be the number one red zone threat within this offense. Last season, Calvin Ridley was number one amongst all Jaguars in red zone targets, 26. The second highest was Zay Jones with 10. Third highest was Evan Engram with 9. So with the top 2 red zone threats gone, Evan Engram should find himself a lot more opportunity within the red zone this season in an advantageous matchup that should be a shootout. Number 6, we have Mark Andrews. Last time he took on the Kansas City Chiefs was in the playoffs. 2 receptions, 15 yards, 2.5 fantasy points. Now, I want to put it out there. He only played 31% of the offensive snaps, primarily because he was still recovering from the fractured fibula that he sustained in that Thursday Night Football game against the Cincinnati Bengals just 2 months prior to this game. So obviously they were trying to ease him in, but he wasn't at a full rate. They didn't allow him to play this full game. Therefore, his overall opportunities and his production weren't at the level. But what we saw earlier in 2023 from weeks 2 through 10 in games in which he was healthy, 6.5 targets per game, 12.18 fantasy points per game, because he is a huge red zone threat. He has been the primary red zone target getter in this offense and the number one in that category for each of the last, 5 seasons since 2019. That is going to continue going into this week. We're hoping for Mark Andrews to find himself in the end zone, but if he's not able to, the yardage and receptions will be able to do the trick. Number 7, we have George Kittle. Taking on the New York Jets. Again, it is a very difficult matchup for wide receivers, but on the other hand, for the tight end position, we often find success. Last season, the Jets allowed the 10th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, 10.03. Now, the deal with George Kittle is that typically he does need a touchdown to find himself ultimate success. But in the 8 games last season in which he was able to put up double-digit fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format, 4 of those games were able to be accomplished without a receiving touchdown. Considering his ability to make plays after the catch and gather yardage, unlike any other tight end in the National Football League, and considering Brandon Ayuk has been missing from training camp over the course of last month, obviously he's practicing this week, but considering his absence, there may be a potential focus on getting the ball to guys like Christian McCaffrey, Deebo Samuel, and George Kittle far more than Brandon Ayuk going into the given week based on the difficulty of the matchup and Sauce Gardner. Number 8, we have Kyle Pitts. Very similar to Dalton Kincaid, we're going to get all of our questions answered. Everyone's going to witness just how big of a difference it is going from guys like Marcus Mariota, Desmond Ridder, Taylor Heineke, to now going to Kirk Cousins. I really do believe it is going to really show in week 1. I mean, just talking about Kirk Cousins and how he utilized his tight ends over the course of the last 2 years. TJ Hawkinson averaging 8.5 and 9.4 targets per game within those given seasons. So if you give this man opportunity, he takes on a matchup against Pittsburgh. They allowed the 8th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends last season. And even though Arthur Smith, the former head coach and offensive play caller of this team, is going to be on the opposite side of the field for the Pittsburgh Steelers, it could be a little bit of a revenge game. I do believe they utilized them the wrong way over the course of the last couple seasons, and Zach Robinson is going to get him in the correct positions to find himself ultimate success. Number 9, we have David Njoku. The biggest concern about David Njoku is his usage within the offense based on the quarterback play. Obviously, we all know how much success he found with Joe Flacco last season, 9.3 targets per game, 14.8 fantasy points per game. Now with Deshaun Watson, it was on the complete opposite end of the spectrum with only 5.2 targets and 6.3 fantasy points per game. But the biggest difference between the quarterback play isn't the volume of targets, it's the volume of pass plays that are called within these games. Deshaun Watson was averaging 33 passing attempts per game last season, while Joe Flacco was averaging 41 as the starting quarterback of this offense. There is a huge difference there, and therefore the opportunities of David Njoku diminish due to the quarterback play and the play calling tendencies of Kevin Stefanski, the head coach and primary play caller. But hopefully, they're going to continue to litter David Njoku with targets, considering how great he was at the back end of the 2023 year. And hopefully, Deshaun Watson was paying attention to that. Number 10, we have Jake Ferguson. Jake Ferguson, in my mind, is the end of the must-start tight ends based on how we drafted them. These are the top 10 tight ends in 2024. And if you selected one of these top 10 guys, they have to start this week. Outside of him, we can start messing around with the overall rankings. But Jake Ferguson obviously takes on the Cleveland Browns. Amongst all teams in 2023, they allowed the fewest tight end targets. Again, their coverage against tight ends was incredible. They allowed the second fewest fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, only 7.29. Luckily for Jake Ferguson, amongst all tight ends in the National Football League last season, he had the most overall red zone targets. And additionally, he was number 5 amongst all players. So if those red zone target shares are going to continue to exist for Jake Ferguson, he can absolutely make his week with scoring a touchdown rather than having to worry about the overall receptions and receiving yards that he's going to gather within the overall matchup. Moving on to our number 11, we have Taysom Hill. So now I'm going to go ahead and talk about the following players at an extended rate, just so that if in fact you have an opportunity of playing one of these guys because you've waited on the tight end position, it may give you a little bit more confidence in playing them. The deal with Taysom Hill is, amongst all of the other tight ends that we're going to mention further on for the remainder of this video, he has probably the highest touchdown upside, primarily based on what we have seen over the course of the last 2 years and the usage we have seen in the preseason of this 2024 year. Now, going into this week, the expectation is that we are going to see Juwan Johnson return from his injury, which could cap the upside of Taysom Hill's receiving game, but where Taysom Hill primarily succeeds is in the rushing category. In 2023, in games in which he had 5 or more rushing attempts, was averaging 13.57 fantasy points per game in those 7 games. The Carolina Panthers last year were giving up the most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs in terms of running back rushing statistics isolated, nearly 18 fantasy points per game. And we know going into this week that Taysom Hill is going to be the number 2 rushing leader of this offense just behind Alvin Kamara. And if there is a possibility in which they get down into the red zone, I would not surprise me that Clint Kubiak utilizes a Wildcat style offense and gets, Taysom Hill a couple rushing attempts on the goal line, especially considering Clint Kubiak, a former passing game coordinator of the 49ers last season, saw everything that, Kyle Shanahan did with Deebo Samuel, can utilize Taysom Hill in a very similar manner. That's why he's our number 11 going into the given week. Number 12, we have Pat Freiermuth. I really like Pat Freiermuth this season, primarily because of the offensive coordinator change. You bring in a guy like Arthur Smith, the former Atlanta head coach. Of course, this is a revenge game in week 1 taking on the Atlanta Falcons. But last season, the Atlanta Falcons targeted their tight ends 10.18 times per game for 6.65 receptions, 80.65 yards, 0.41 receiving touchdowns, and 13.86 fantasy points per game. And the anticipation is that we're going to see a lot of Pat Freiermuth within this Pittsburgh Steelers offense because outside of George Pickens and maybe Jaylen Warren, there's no other target competition to take targets away from Pat Freiermuth. Therefore, he should be the number 2 of this offense. He should be lining up out wide in the inline within the slot position like we have seen him line up throughout the entirety of this preseason and should find himself a lot of target opportunity in a game in which they should be trailing for a majority of the contest. Number 13, we have Hunter Henry. Hunter Henry did return to practice yesterday, which is a huge upgrade to the potential of his success this upcoming week, primarily because of the matchup. Taking on the Bengals, they allowed the second most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends last season, 11.62. Additionally, the Patriots are the biggest underdogs going into week 1 based on Vegas overall spreads. So if in fact we're going to see a game in which the New England Patriots are trailing, this is going to be a negative game script in a heavy passing attack. And currently with their current offensive coordinator, Alex Van Pelt, the former offensive coordinator of the Cleveland Browns, very familiar with the Bengals defense, utilized a lot of David Njoku within those given matchups. And even if you go back to 2022, in the season in which Alex Van Pelt was the offensive coordinator and they had Jacoby Brissett, obviously the starting quarterback of this New England Patriots team in 2024. From weeks 1 through 12, when Brissett was the starter for the Cleveland Browns, he was averaging 8.55 targets per game to his tight ends, and it was averaging 10.65 fantasy points per game for those tight ends. So if in fact we're in a situation in which Hunter Henry, fully healthy, ready to go, in a negative game script, should find himself a lot of success and should be the number 1 receiving target of the New England Patriots offense. Number 14, we have Dallas Goedert. Dallas Goedert is off the injury report as well, which is obviously great. And considering he has a new offensive coordinator, there is potential in which he could find himself a lot of success, primarily because we have seen Kellen Moore get his tight ends a lot of targets over the last couple of years, whether it's been with the Dallas Cowboys or Los Angeles Chargers. Last season, the Los Angeles Chargers were ranked 8th in tight end targets, 9th in receptions, 17th in yards, and 6th in receiving touchdowns. Again, on a weekly average, that's 7.8 targets per game and 10.5 fantasy points per game, and about a half a touchdown per game on average. Unfortunately, within the red zone, Dallas Goedert over the course of the last couple of years has been the number 5 option behind Jalen Hurts in his rushing ability. Of course, whatever running back they had at the time, A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith. And then it would go to Dallas Goedert. If that changes, obviously it upgrades his potential. But if it continues to be the same, the number 14 spot is safe. Number 15, we have Brock Bowers. We have heard that obviously he's been dealing with an injury, but he should be cleared to play against the Los Angeles Chargers. In my opinion, a rookie tight end in week 1 is pretty much a shot in the dark, as much as any other shot in the dark that you could potentially take in week 1. We do know that, of course, the current offensive coordinator and the new offensive coordinator of the Las Vegas Raiders utilized Cole Kmet last season with the Chicago Bears at a premium rate within the red zone. Amongst all players was number 23 in red zone targets, but amongst all tight ends, number 4 in red zone targets. So if Brock Bowers is going to, at very least, have himself a red zone role, despite the fact that he has not practiced with the team in the last couple weeks, that will be valuable enough to make him a top 16 starting option. Number 16, we have Dalton Schultz. The target competition is the biggest worry for me. When you have to compete with guys like Stephon Diggs and Tank Dell, on top of Nico Collins. I mean, even last season, in the games in which they took on the Indianapolis Colts, 4 catches for 34, 5 catches for 42. And Stephon Diggs and Tank Dell didn't play in that second game. So if, in fact, we're getting an increase in target competition, it may lead to Dalton Schultz getting far less production. Additionally, it could lead to him getting far more open opportunities, considering this defense is worrying about all these receiving options. Nonetheless, I'm anticipating Dalton Schultz to get himself utilization, but not enough to get him into the higher conversation within the rankings. Okay, let's go ahead and move on, and let's begin by talking about the number 1 at the quarterback position. That is Josh Allen going into week 1, which again is a no-brainer. If you drafted Josh Allen as the first quarterback off the board, you're starting him. No questions about it. They take on the Arizona Cardinals, who allowed the 6th most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks last season. Based on Vegas's overall projections, the Buffalo Bills are implied to score 30 points in week 1. If they're going to do so, I mean, whether that's on the ground or through the air, Josh Allen's going to find success. Since week 11 of last season, Josh Allen's been averaging 25.8 fantasy points per game and 1.2 rushing touchdowns per game on average. Has scored a rushing touchdown in 14 of the last 17 games he has played, minimum. The expectation is immediate success in week 1. Number 2, we have Jalen Hurts. Again, another one of these automatic starts, but has to play his first game of the season in Brazil. Instead of it being a home game in Philly, which would have been a huge advantage, you got to go ahead and take a 9-hour flight down to Brazil and potentially play in a shootout. Based on Vegas overall totals, this is expected to be and tied with the 3rd highest scoring point total going into the week. So hopefully a shootout. Kellen Moore, obviously a new offensive coordinator. We're going to have to see how this offense looks. Hopefully the pace of play is going to continue, primarily because last season the Philadelphia Eagles and Los Angeles Chargers, who Kellen Moore was the offensive coordinator of last year, pretty much had an identical pace of play. So it's going to be at the top of the league. They're going to run a lot of plays. It's just a matter of, is Jalen Hurts going to turn over the ball, which hopefully he doesn't. He had 20 turnovers last year, but he also did have himself 15 rushing touchdowns. And if he's able to at least get himself, in that overall conversation of scoring another rushing touchdown, fantastic. If, in fact, the tush push isn't a part of the game, no problem, because he's going to still be throwing the touchdowns within the red zone and at very least getting a piece of it within the given matchup. Number 3, to begin the A tier, the thumbnail of today's episode, we have Patrick Mahomes. Patrick Mahomes, the last time he took on the Baltimore Ravens, was in the NFL playoffs. In that game, 30 of 39 passing, 77% passing completion percentage, 241 passing yards, 1 passing touchdown, 15 rushing yards, and 15.1 fantasy points. Again, when you're in the playoffs, it's a little bit of more of a stressful matchup. Obviously, both of the offenses, Kansas City and Baltimore, didn't find ultimate success, yet the Kansas City Chiefs were able to get the job done. But going into this week's matchup on Thursday Night Football, we have September Mahomes returning. September Mahomes is a real thing. Since 2021, in the last 9 September games, has thrown 24 passing touchdowns and 6 interceptions. 2.7 passing touchdowns per game on average. Hopefully, we're going to see him throw 3 in tomorrow's game. And with Xavier Worthy as an addition, it just threatens the defense that much more to allow Patrick Mahomes to litter guys like, of course, Travis Kelce and Rashee Rice with a bunch of targets that are going to lead to success. Number 4, we have Anthony Richardson. Anthony Richardson should be in a negative game script, primarily because the Colts haven't won a week 1 matchup in the last decade. I'm anticipating this team to be trailing. Again, they're a home team that is expected to be an underdog this week. They're one of only 2. I think the Giants are the only other one as of this current moment in time. And obviously the numbers can shift, but that in itself kind of implies that the Houston Texans are a vast favorite within the overall week. Over the course of last season, in the games in which Anthony Richardson was healthy and played, the 2 full healthy games he played, 20.9 fantasy points and 29.6, was top 5 in both those weeks. And additionally, in week 2, took on the Houston Texans. In that game, only played 1 quarter prior to leaving with an injury. And in 1 quarter, scored 17.7 fantasy points, primarily because he had 3 rushing attempts for 35 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. We're expecting a high-scoring game, and one in which, of course, Anthony Richardson will be fighting back and clawing to try to keep up with the Houston Texans offense. Speaking of the Houston Texans offense, we have CJ Stroud. Like I mentioned just moments ago, it is expected to be the 3rd highest scoring game of week 1, or at least tied with that. And the fact that the Colts haven't won a week 1 matchup in the last decade leads me to believe that, of course, CJ Stroud should continue his reign of success against this defense, one that he found last season in both overall matchups. Week 2, 384 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 21.5 fantasy points. Week 18, 264 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 20.6 fantasy points. Going into the week, I believe that Underdog Fantasy currently has a number of 1.5 passing touchdowns for CJ Stroud. We're taking the higher on that, and we'll talk about a potential pick 'em slip at the end of today's video for those of you interested. Moving on to our number 6, we have Lamar Jackson to close out this tier. When he took on the Kansas City Chiefs in the AFC Championship game, one of the worst games he's played within the entire year. Only a 54% passing completion percentage, 20 of 37, but could have very easily had himself a 2nd passing touchdown if it wasn't for the fact that, of course, Zay Flowers fumbled on the 1-inch line. Still had himself 272 passing yards, a passing touchdown, 8 rushing attempts for 54 yards and 17.6 fantasy points. He pretty much averages somewhere between 45 to 55 rushing yards per game on average. At least last season, 48 on average. If he's going to get himself 5 points based on rushing yardage, and he's potentially able to even score a rushing touchdown, we get ourselves a 5 to 11 point split just off of rushing statistics isolated. On top of that, obviously is an underdog. They're going to have to throw the ball for a lot of this game. And when they do so, all the yardage that he gains and all the points that he's going to gather will keep him in this top 6 conversation going into the given week. But of course, we all know that the Kansas City Chiefs defense is great. Therefore, it'll make it a little bit more difficult on Lamar. Number 7, we have Joe Burrow, who of course has himself a great matchup. Takes on the New England Patriots, and New England still got some great defenders. Even though New England is considered, like 8-point underdogs, the expectation is that Joe Burrow should be perfectly fine. And considering we did see Jamar Chase heading to practice earlier today, leads me to believe that Joe Burrow will have all of his weapons ready to go. And now that he's coming off of a healthy offseason, the first of the last 3 seasons, we should immediately see Joe Burrow lighting up the league. I mean, the last 5 games he played last season prior to his injury was able to get himself 2 or more passing touchdowns every single week. They are huge favorites, and Joe Burrow should find himself a lot of success, especially with Jamar Chase back. Number 8, we have Jordan Love, taking on the Philadelphia Eagles in Brazil. Again, one of the higher scoring matchups in terms of implicated points based on Vegas. I mean, again, Jordan Love, to end the 2023 season, was on fire. 15 of his 19 games, 2 or more touchdowns minimum. Additionally, the final 10 games of the season, he was averaging 20.53 fantasy points per game in a 4-point per passing touchdown format. If you take that into account with the fact that the Philadelphia Eagles last season were allowing the 2nd most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, 17.88, the expectation is a lot of success in week 1 for Jordan Love. Number 9, we have Kyler Murray. Like I mentioned earlier with Josh Allen, the Buffalo Bills are expected to score about 30 points in this game, and they are 6.5 point favorites. So the fact that Kyler Murray and the Arizona Cardinals are underdogs by a full touchdown potentially leads me to believe that, of course, they're going to be throwing the ball a lot. Now, last season in games between weeks 10 through 18 with Kyler as a starter, they were only throwing the ball about 33.5 times per game, but he was still able to average 18.3 fantasy points per game post ACL recovery. So if we're able to get Kyler into this conversation, another year removed from the ACL, I mean, again, last season in those 8 games, 6 of them were top 14 ranked weeks. The expectation that Kyler Murray should find himself immediate success, get himself a lot of passing attempts because they're trying to come back in this game. And if in fact they're able to lead, even better. I mean, he's going to be scoring a lot of touchdowns. And of course, the rushing upside is always implicated. Number 10, we have Matthew Stafford. Again, this is technically based on Vegas, the highest implicated scoring game of the week. Should be a shootout, 51 total points. The fact that the Detroit Lions last season were allowing the 5th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks just off of passing statistics isolated is incredible. It makes this a automatic start for Matthew Stafford. Last season, in the game against the Detroit Lions, 367 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 22.7 fantasy points. In the final 7 games of Matthew Stafford's 2023 season, was able to get himself 2+ touchdowns in 6 of those 7 games and averaged 20.64 fantasy points per game. I'm expecting a lot of success from Stafford in week 1, healthy and ready to go. Number 11, we have Jayden Daniels, the rookie quarterback for the Washington Commanders. If we're anticipating that he is going to get himself in a situation, considering his mobility and his upside for mobility, if he's going to get somewhere between 45 to 65 rushing yards, 4.5 to 6.5 fantasy points. And it has an upside potential of scoring a rushing touchdown. Anything that he is able to accomplish within the passing game, assuming they're not turnovers, is just going to be, bonus points for us. He's going to be throwing the ball a bunch, especially considering the Tampa Bay Buccaneers last season giving up the 9th most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks based on passing statistics isolated. We are anticipating at base minimum top 12 potential for Jayden Daniels, and the rushing upside continues to elevate that. Number 12, we have Tua Tagovailoa, who, again, taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars should be an exciting matchup. They allowed the 7th most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks last season. And even though there was the potential of guys like Raheem Mostert, Devon Achane scoring rushing touchdowns, even Jonnu Smith could score a rushing touchdown. Who knows? Even though that is a potential of that, September Tua is a thing. Even though I've talked about September Mahomes, September Tua is legit. In the last 6 healthy games he has played in the month of September, 16 passing touchdowns, 4 interceptions, averaging 22.15 fantasy points per game. Implicated to be a potential shootout here. I'm excited for Tua Tagovailoa's potential in week 1. We move on to our number 13. On the other end of this overall matchups, we have Jacksonville Jaguars starting quarterback Trevor Lawrence. If this is going to be a shootout as we anticipate, and the Dolphins allowing the 11th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks last season on a per game average 14.3, if this is going to be a back and forth game, and Trevor Lawrence and the Jacksonville Jaguars are going to be in a negative game script for majority of this contest, trying to keep up with the Miami Dolphins offense, and the fact that he is rushing upside every single week and can always find himself with 30, 40 yards, potentially even a rushing touchdown, this kind of a matchup elevates his overall potential and keeps him into this top 15 conversation as my number 13. Number 14, we have Jared Goff. Jared Goff is just consistent. He is consistent play every single week. Is he going to have, outliers in which he has, a game in which he puts up 8 points or a game he puts up 35 points? Sure, but ultimately, we are going to see consistency out of Jared Goff. If we're able to get 2 touchdowns, fantastic. Otherwise, I'm anticipating something between 16 to 17 fantasy points in the given week. That's why I have him at number 14, purely out of consistency. Last season, in the game in which he took on the Rams, 22 of 27, an 82% passing completion percentage, 14.8 fantasy points, 277 passing yards, 1 passing touchdown, and didn't utilize very much of Amon-Ra St. Brown in the second half or Sam LaPorta for the entirety of the game. If he's able to get more implementation out of both those guys, should be an even better play. Number 15, we have Caleb Williams. It is going to be a difficult matchup, not only because it is the first NFL game of his career, same thing with guys like Jayden Daniels, but it's going to be a difficult matchup because the secondary for the Tennessee Titans, I really do believe, is improved. Now, if Caleb Williams comes out and just lights this defense up, we're not going to be surprised. We're expecting him to do so. He's the number 1 overall pick of the draft. But just putting it out there, based on projections via Vegas, they're expected to score 24 points. So if the Chicago Bears are projected to score 3 touchdowns, we're going to hope that at least 2 of them are implicated with Caleb Williams, whether they're passing or rushing, going into the given matchup. The final 2 quarterbacks that I wanted to mention are kind of guys that I want to mention at the same time. Kind of honorable mentions that both have very difficult matchups. Dak Prescott taking on the Cleveland Browns, the second most difficult matchup at the quarterback position. Brock Purdy taking on the New York Jets, 2023's most difficult matchup at the quarterback position. Again, both of them are going to be up against it based on matchup. But again, Dak Prescott played very well last season. 11 of his last 12 games consisting of 2 or more passing touchdowns, lighting up opposing secondaries. And if CeeDee Lamb's at a full capacity, we should be good to go. Brock Purdy, again, sits as that number 17, primarily because he doesn't have as much rushing potential as the alternative options, doesn't have as good of a matchup. And if, in fact, the New York Jets secondary, which again is a Robert Saleh defense, Robert Saleh, obviously very familiar with Kyle Shanahan. They were on the same coaching staff for a very long time. If that defense is going to continue to play well, Brock Purdy is just a lesser option in my mind in comparison to the field. All right, guys, that's going to cover my top 16/17 quarterback rankings. Before we go ahead and close out today's video, I want to go ahead and head on over to Underdog Fantasy and put together a couple pick'em slips because, again, going into tomorrow's game, 0.5 total yards, a free pick via Travis Kelce. So all you got to do is sign up today using code Andrew, make that first time deposit minimum of $10. You'll get the rankings every single Sunday. But you'll also be able to go ahead and participate in the pick'em slips. Now, going into this season, I want to go ahead and put together a series of sorts that includes me putting together one pick'em slip every single week and putting my money where my mouth is. So in this given week, I'm trusting the following 3 plays and putting a lot of money on it. It's a $1,000 entry. We have Christian McCaffrey anytime rushing or receiving touchdown, Garrett Wilson higher than 5.5 receptions, and CJ Stroud higher than 1.5 passing touchdowns. We talked about CJ Stroud earlier. They take on the Colts. It is the second highest implicated scoring game of the week. On top of it, the Houston Texans are favored even though they are an away team. Only 2 of those teams this week are favored on the road. One being, of course, the Minnesota Vikings and the other being the Houston Texans. The fact that the Colts haven't won a game in the last 10 seasons in week 1, and the fact that the last time that CJ Stroud has taken on this defense, 250 plus passing yards in each of those games, 2+ touchdowns. He has the addition of guys like Stephon Diggs and the return of Tank Dell. 1.5 passing touchdowns is an automatic. As for Garrett Wilson, even if Aaron Rodgers goes down with another Achilles injury in week 1, I would assume that Tyrod Taylor would be able to elevate Garrett Wilson to at least 6 receptions. I talked about it just a couple of days ago when we talked about wide receiver rankings in regards to Davante Adams in his final year with Aaron Rodgers. Only 2 games consisted of less than 6 total receptions. So if we're going to be in a situation in which Garrett Wilson is going to find one of those 2 games being the Davante Adams of this offense associated with Aaron Rodgers, so be it. I'll get chopped at the knees. But, of course, Christian McCaffrey, my favorite play of the week. Anytime touchdown. He's been able to score at least 1 touchdown in 25 of the last 28 games, including the playoffs. A massive streak that hopefully, if you guys are interested, follow. But be responsible when you do so. Not these crazy numbers in which I'm going ahead, but I'm putting my money where my mouth is every single week for the remainder of the season. And that's going to cover it. Again, check out Underdog Fantasy. Check out the Pickems. There is a lot of plays to take advantage of, especially considering the book isn't really prepared for week 1 like we are, considering all the research we have done. So check that out. Take advantage of it. Thank you, everybody, for watching. I'll be back tomorrow live streaming from 2 to 5 p.m. before the kickoff of the 2024 NFL season. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.